Hello, my name is Jason Reichl, and you're listening to Risk Management Brick by Brick. I'm fascinated with people who are helping build and maintain the physical world around us. On each episode of this podcast, we'll dive in with a risk manager, speak to them about how technology plays a role in this process. Hello, welcome to another episode of Brick by Brick. Today, I'm joined by two guests, Brian and David, both from Acrisure, doing vastly interesting things in risk with a very, very interesting company that I'm always excited to talk to anyone from your organization. Before we get started, why don't we fill people in on sort of your background and what you do at Acrisure? Let's start with Brian.
Thank you, Jason. My name is Brian Fielkow, and my role at Acrisure is Executive Vice President, Risk Resources. And what we do is create tools, strategies, solutions on an enterprise-wide basis to help our clients better manage risk. And the more they manage risk, the more they're able to take control of their insurance costs.
Amazing. Yeah, that's something we're always talking about on the podcast. We're talking about what are actionable ways that you could prevent insurance increases, or the holy grail is reduce insurance premiums, right? David, what about you? What's your background and how did you end up in the seat you're at?
Well, hey, Jason, great to be with you today. Really appreciate it. And Dave Weinstein, I head risk and claims for Acrisure's Western region. And if you think about what Brian just said and just apply it on a regional basis, really very parallel goals, which mirrors the construct of Acrisure's regional structure.
Great. Let's dig into that a little bit. So the company has a structure of sort of like a corporate business structure, and then regional deployments of those skills down into individual regions. Am I right about that?
Yes. I mean, our company is divided into different business units. We call them platforms regionally, and the regions have just incredibly talented risk advisors. But the thing is, everybody's got different experience. So what we're doing is we're coordinating on a national basis to get our clients the expertise they need wherever they're located.
Yeah, I really admire that model, because risk does, even if you're a national business, risk is at a local level with contextual parameters flowing into that, right? So it's really nice to see that your organization is structured the way that risk actually happens within businesses.
Yeah, and geography has something to do with it too. Different states have different laws. Different. If you're a diversified company, you may have several different businesses, and each of those businesses may pose a different risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's well said, Brian. So the key, Jason, also with that regional structure is allows us to bring regional expertise, leverage within our respective regions, but then also leverage out nationally and use the collective knowledge, capabilities, and wisdom of our teams throughout the country and internationally as well.
Yeah, Brian, I have been a fan and followed you for a while, and I know that your experience in safety and culture building is pretty influential in the industry, and it's something that I was really looking forward to drilling in on the podcast today. What sort of influences do you take into the way that you view risk and the way that you view leadership, and sort of what are some of your core principles in those areas?
A lot of it, my view starts with culture, and let's just call culture a hidden risk. I mean, sometimes you can't see the issues in culture the way you can see whether or not a machine guard is in place.
Yes, right.
There are some things that are obvious. Culture can be hidden, but when you look at a company's performance, for better or worse, generally it's rooted in culture. In other words, any company can have everything planned just right and have a shock loss. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about frequency that just won't go away. We're doing the same thing again and again and again. And generally, it's got its roots in either leadership, how we hire, how we train, how we manage, the clarity of our process, accountability. Those are some of the foundations and the foundational elements of culture. And generally, when you've got something that's just kind of continues to repeat itself, you're going to probably 9 times out of 10 find the problem there.
Yeah, I love that ideology, because often smart people in a room think everything is driven down to tactics, when really sometimes it's something far more more under the surface than that. Just sticking on that for 1 second, and Brian, how do you go about uncovering, particularly about risk culture? How do you particularly diagnose and dive into a company's culture around risk? And David, feel free to jump in here too. But how is it a mechanism? Is it a framework? Is it how do you actually make those assessments? And how can someone, a risk manager listening to this, make some of those cultural assessments within their organization?
A couple things, and then I want to turn it over to David, but I'll just give you two thoughts. First of all, let's start with the premise that there's no such thing as a minor accident. Okay, so a lot of times what people will do is they'll give a major incident or a major crash more attention, and that's what we're going to stop doing right away. I'm as interested in the frequency, even if the outcome isn't significant. And I'll never use the word accident, because to me accident implies lack of preventability, when we know that most, not all, but most incidents and crashes, in fact, are preventable. So we got to start to change our thinking. But then, as to where we start, where possible, as much data as possible. I want to see a baseline, whether it's loss runs, whether it's your OSHA, your DOT scores, whatever industry you're in. The data tells a story, and if I can see that story, especially before I've met somebody, before we've developed perceptions, that data is a good baseline. So a data-driven approach combined with sort of a culture approach, and one where we're not reactive. Oh, there was a major injury, let's get involved. No, let's get involved way before it even happens and focus on prevention.
Yeah, one of the things I love about that, Brian, is my philosophy for leadership and management in general is, by oftentimes when management or leadership is getting involved, it's far too late in that process, right? The decisions that got you there have already happened, and so the only thing you can do is start to build a forensics account, essentially, of what happened so that you can change process or change culture in order to make that happen. David, when we think about this at a regional level, then you have another layer on top of that that's then culture that's happening in regional environments for organizations. How does that play a factor in it?
Well, Jason, there's that regional element, and of course, every region does have its culture. California is sometimes viewed as a more laid-back state, but certainly from a regulatory context, absolutely not the case. And frankly, from a business context, not accurate either. This is a hard driving area. Companies are very focused on their success. And you said something earlier about the kind of like penultimate goal showing up on the premium side. But I think where the really interesting stuff happened, as Brian said, is culturally. So you may find as a seasoned professional, you can look at their data set right away and assess that, wow, there are issues here. But what gets more interesting is when you come to find that the C-suite, the leadership, feels they have a culture of safety, though the data indicates otherwise, and other techniques we may deploy, such as interviewing staff from different levels of the company, you can derive a completely different narrative where the team says, we do not have a culture of safety, completely contrary to that of leadership. And that's where really Brian, myself, and this team we have here at Acrisure can affect a lot of change. We can introduce that reality, start talking about things that do need to happen if you want to see these results manifest.
Yeah, I completely understand that, because I think one of the key things that I run into a lot talking to risk managers is the role and the function has at times been subservient to leadership and what they think and what decisions they make based on, okay, this is how I view safety or how I view risk. And then there's also the actual function of keeping people safe on job sites, keeping people safe in environments. The safety aspect of risk is as important as the fundamental, loss that risk can have or the transfer of risk in insurance. And I think, far too often risk transfer is looked at as the only solution for risk within a business. Although, if you go to any schooling for risk, your risk matrix says that a lot of the risk that you face every day has nothing to do with risk transfer and can't actually be transferred by risk. Can we talk about some of the ways that you have built programs or that you recommend risk managers and organizations look at their risk from a category standpoint or from a framework? I always like to give people tangible to-dos from the podcast.
Well, I think I'd like to start just by the assumption that kind of risk, the function is delegated. You mentioned sort of a disconnect with leadership. But let's just start with the basics, okay? The risk is actually the language and property of the boardroom. So if the boardroom's not focusing on that, there's a gap right there. And you got to be able to have conversations with your C-suite. It's called managing up, right? But you got to have fierce conversations. I speak with a lot of risk managers, safety executives. It's like, well, if I could only get the CEO's attention, well then why don't you? And I know it's not easy, but sometimes you got to start to talk. If you're going to talk the language of the boardroom, then you got to say, well, look, we're talking about cyber risks and we're talking about customer risks and employee risks, et cetera. Well, that's where this belongs, And if you're doing well, let's say you're not having incidents or injuries or crashes, the absence of injuries may or may not mean you're doing well. It might mean you're good or you're lucky. Like the absence of bankruptcy doesn't necessarily mean you're doing financially well. It's the same conversation. So you got to talk to your executives about what is the real cost of loss. It's multiples of what you see on your loss runs. If you're just looking at your insurance loss runs to understand what's the real cost of not managing risk, you're missing most of the cost.
I love that. Yeah, totally makes sense. I like the idea that talking in the language of the boardroom, and anybody that's been in a boardroom knows what you're doing is you're assessing the risk of pursuing growth, right? And I think that sometimes risk managers are trying to mitigate risk so much that they're not focused that without risk there is no business, right? And so that's clear. And then how do you position things so that you can go after and do more risky things in the safest way possible? Because often in that area that's where there's money or area that your business could grow into that maybe you're not servicing today. So I do feel like there's a new camp of risk managers which are very tied to that boardroom mentality, which is very tied to this idea of speaking the language of the business and trying to convert risk diagnoses to business language. In certain industries, you still have very much, a lot of times in construction, you still have a lot of risk managers that come from the field who their primary concern is not slowing down the job. Often in those environments, they have a culture where most people might not feel comfortable reporting risks because that might delay the job, and they know that's what the company's hyper-focused on. So there's a lot of cultural norms here that you have to navigate. From your guys' perspective, what are some of the emerging? You mentioned cyber, so I'm gonna jump off that. What are some of the emerging risks that you see, and how are you telling customers to go after and solve these problems? An example: the risk, the fundamental risk of AI versus the benefit of potentially using AI to improve your business practices, improve your accountability, improve these things, which I think also AI can do. So how are you guys navigating sort of these gray zones?
Hey, Jason, before we move past this, I just wanted to add one comment, if I could, to
Please,
Brian,
absolutely.
in that other area, which is this. It's always a challenge professionally if you're given responsibility without authority. And that can lead to a lack of success on the part of an individual, a business unit, et cetera. In the area of risk, in a risk management capacity, that now you're taking that to another level. To your point, if you have a risk manager who doesn't feel empowered, that they can speak to the board, speak to the C-suite. If you have an employee who does not have stop work authority, if something dangerous is happening in their eyes, first of all, that tells us a lot about your culture right there, and at minimum, the efficacy of your safety program. But it's really critical for organizations, companies to understand that risk dynamic goes beyond the individual, the unit, to the overall health and safety of the company itself. Really, Brian has a great expression that he likes to use, which is where you have to meet them where they're at. And so figure out where they're at and try to broach that as quickly as you can. So if they're missing that component, we're going to meet them there, try to get, if we can, maybe we can help get them the authority, the importance, the weight that they need to make things better.
Yeah. Tailing that into the next question I had, and I'll go to you, Brian, on that, which is how can risk managers be accountable to such emerging things that they might not even be educated on? And is that where like an organization like yours, who is essentially on the, the peripheral cutting edge of what risk is and what's happening regionally, globally, all these things. Is that where they should really partner with you? Because I'm finding that so many risk managers are in this, let's call it the second phase of their career, and the number of things that they have to manage as risk now is significantly increased over time, even though technology has been put in place. And what my hypothesis is visibility is there now, so you can actually see all the risks that existed forever. But now you can actually see those risks, and risk managers are having a difficult time wrapping their arms around all of the new types of risk that now they're supposed to be accountable for, but they don't feel like they have the knowledge base or the, to your point, the responsibility. They don't understand, they don't know what it means to be responsible for these things. How are you educating your customers, or how are you working with your clients in order to bridge that gap? And is it really that a lot of these organizations need professional outside third-party help in order to build these programs because the internal teams might not have that capacity or capability?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely situations where third-party help is needed, right? To me, the ideal situation is where you come in and you give them the tools they need, you teach them so that they can take care of themselves, then you're there monitoring. But again, to David's point about meeting people where they're at, that's why you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. But when it comes to technology, AI, I mean, look, technology has such ability to improve outcomes when it comes to risk management. I think the most classic example would be dual-facing cameras in trucks. It's a game changer. I mean, but yet there are a lot of people that are just afraid to put them in because, what if the cameras find that my driver was doing something wrong? But I can give you example after example after example where you raise the bar. And will there be times that the cameras finding you do something wrong? Sure. But it makes you smarter in dealing with that. But most of the time, cameras are about coaching. They're about, not using the technology punitive. Whether we're talking about technology integration, AI, anything like that, in my mind, it's a subset of change management. Your ability to integrate the technology is a direct reflection of your company's ability to manage change, which means understanding the user's concerns. The end users probably have valid concerns, and you probably can develop, you can't just say, just do it. That may work for one particular company, at least their marketing, but just to do it doesn't work when we're managing our frontline employees. So we've got to make sure that when we're going to bring in AI, when we're going to bring in technology-driven risk management solutions, we have to understand how it impacts the users. I'm not saying we put it up for a vote, but the more that we can empathize with them and the more adept we are at change management, the more easily we can integrate the change. But looking the other way and saying, well, here's 5 reasons not to do it, doesn't work.
And also everyone, and other businesses are moving forward with it, right? So
yeah.
When you think about AI, I've seen in contracts recently with TrustLayer, some brokerages, some other people putting in, well, we can't use your solution if you use AI. And I'm like, well, that makes sense if you want to put yourself backwards 5 years while other companies move forwards. And I understand that you might not have your arms wrapped around this problem yet. That's a real thing. Nobody does, let's be honest about that as it relates to AI. Nobody has their arms wrapped around the whole problem. But you can't be left behind. That's part of, I think, now the risk manager going, if we want to do business in this way and stay competitive, we have to introduce these new risks and we need to wrap our mind around it. And that can only happen to all the points that you've given around cultural changes, change management. One thing I wanted to talk about is that punitive piece, because this is a big thing where if you take something like aviation, if you're a pilot and you see something wrong with the plane and you call in something, then obviously in the way that works, you're not going to be liable if then something happens with the plane and it's a mechanical thing because you called it out. Well, in regular business, we are not so inclined to that. So I would like to understand, how do you create culture and help people understand that you have to reward good behavior on those. In that camera example, when you see someone has a good driving record and you look at the camera and you realize that, hey, this person is doing exactly what they should be doing, they should be incentivizing that too, and not just looking for the individuals who are on the punitive side of it, who might not be doing what they're supposed to. Yet I think because so many risk managers come from the industry that they work in, they're highly focused on the punitive. They're highly focused on eliminating the risk versus promoting the growth, I think. Do you guys find a similar thing in working, with your clients? And I'm just wondering, do you have any success stories of taking these technologies, taking these risk services that you provide, and actually making them a boon, not just for the organization's growth, but for the individuals that work within that organization?
Yeah, Jason, that's really well said. And there's certainly some really critical intersectionality between, whether or not safety is a priority or a core value. And if it's an organizational value, the importance of that has to include the concept that if people are operating unsafely, not following practices as prescribed, as Brian said, he mentioned these dual-facing cameras. Sure, you might see things that you wish you hadn't seen, but it's super critical that you do see them, and ideally before something actually occurs. But if it's a core value, that has to include, and I don't love the idea of framing it within just punitive, so both an affirmative side to it, right? We want to reward the behaviors that we want to recognize them, but we also have to have a little teeth behind behaviors that we see, process, and realize that could lead to someone becoming injured or other risk to the organization, whether it's bodily or otherwise. If we don't have that, if there's no teeth to it, it sort of does leave you in a spot where you go, well, how seriously will people take it? On the other hand, we'd prefer to reward them instead of punish them.
Yeah, right. I mean, the truth is most of these businesses, they're doing business. So most of their employees are probably following proper protocol, proper procedures, or there's gaps that they're not even seeing because it's the way they've always done it, right? That the repetitive nature of a lot of the work in which risk occurs in building or driving or any of these examples we have, it's very easy for the practitioner to autopilot, right? And to autopilot on that and not be paying attention to these things.
That's a huge mistake. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. So what I'll advise people to do in view of a safety failure or a near miss, to me, here, when I was running the logistics company, Jetco Delivery, I would always ask, anytime we would do a root cause analysis, and we would do it every time, by the way, I would always want to know, at the end of the day, was this an honest mistake or was this deliberate intentional behavior? Because to me, if you have a one-size-fits-all where, hey, you made a mistake, you'll be punished. Strike one, strike two, strike three. I mean, how do you build fairness there? How do you build a culture where people are willing to report near misses? You're punished, you're punished, you're punished. You take honest mistakes, and by the way, most safety failures, in fact, are the result of honest mistakes, Jason. Just like you said, good employees who've been doing something for a long time, and guess what? They had a bad day. So you do remedial training, you coach. I don't know why you have to throw the book at that person. On the other hand, if by their behavior, I'll use the example if somebody decides to go 50 miles an hour in a school zone, I don't need to see strike two. I really don't. One's enough. So the behavior that led to the safety failure is what ought to dictate the outcome to create that sense of fairness and to get to the right result.
Yeah.
Brian, you would agree that you would prefer to counsel someone who the telematics is telling us is hard-cornered more than once. Let's address this pattern. Let's help them be better before they actually go 50 miles an hour, drive recklessly through a school zone. So we can kind of combine the approach of punitive with affirmative, provide counseling, and then Brian's right. There could be a singular moment or a sequence of events that tell us this can't be fixed, nor should it be fixed, and we need to take other action.
Dave, because of your unique background, we have a lot of brokers listening. We have, people across, and you've kind of moved around in the industry. What's some of the biggest differences between, what you experienced in broker land versus where you're at now, in the way that you guys approach these problems?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, when you come from a legacy brokerage, as I did, and it was a very successful brokerage called Van Trio. What you do is you cater your expertise, your knowledge, your areas of interest, if you will, in the areas where I really need to have deep smarts, to our client base. So being in a Northern California setting, you're really forming yourself to represent the client base that comprises the agency's clients. And when you get into this kind of fintech setting, the diversity goes up the access to resources goes up. And so essentially, just like the risk managers at individual companies, we up our game. We also foster an environment here where you want to learn, you want to absorb. And so I'm constantly looking for what else do we have? Who's a vendor relationship that we've established that can bring a really powerful impact to our clients? What are my resources both internally and externally? And how do I deliver them to maximum impact to the greatest swath of clients that we have just at scale?
Yeah, this conversation, this question might be a little controversial, so either of you can answer it and we can choose to punt it if we want and edit it out. But what is the role of the broker in the current environment we live in? Should that be where risk managers are taking their advice from? Or is it more of should be a cabal now, or a group of individuals who have unique expertise because of the diversity that risk management teams and safety teams are now trying to get under control? Like, how have things changed in your guys' career that you think that the industry might need to catch up on, and how to structure team dynamics? I know there's not a one size fit all, but you must be positioned a lot to sort of make recommendations on how these teams are assembled, what roles people report to, those kind of structural changes that need to happen.
I'll start, Brian, if you don't mind. So, the first thing, Jason, is, you want that client advisor, that frontline sales professional, to be utilizing a consultative approach in their talks with both prospects and active clients. And by extension of that, that does mean that they have to have the knowledge and wherewithal to act in that capacity. Then also, because it's not one or the other, they want to leverage all the capabilities around them. So on coverage, it could be a high-level account executive who has super deep knowledge and smarts in a particular industry or two. It could be on a fleet exposure, heavy fleet exposure, where you want to bring in someone, say, from Acrisure National, who's a DOT and compliance specialist with tremendous fleet experience. So the advisor, one, wants to establish themselves in the circle of trusted advisors for that company. Could include a CPA, could include other professionals as well, but we definitely want to have earned a seat at that table and be approached accordingly. And then that person needs to have the lack of hubris and the understanding that a great client advisor leverages all the tools and human capital around him or her to deliver optimal result to the client.
I really like that. One of the ways that traditional brokerages are still set up is very protective. It's more like the real estate model where it's my book of business, and so they're not really usually so apt to bring in outside talent in order to go deep on that, or even internal sometimes. One of the biggest things working with brokerages is it's our clients, yet we don't know who they are, right? This is a common thing that brokerages often say to me, because it's really contained at the book of business with the brokerage. And I have a feeling that by not opening that aperture up, we aren't doing service to our customers, to the insured, to everyone involved in the value chain, because at this point it really is all hands kind of on in the football field, or at least having everyone in the stand. So when you go, hey, is there a doctor here? If someone raises their hand, right? Like I really feel like that's the mentality that risk management and business services are kind of moving towards, at least the ones that continue to see growth and continued education. On top of that, in the risk market, we're seeing that a lot of brokers are aging out of that, and they have this huge book of business. So who's going to take this over, and how is that actually going to work going into the future? Very interesting times. Brian, do you have anything to add about sort of the structure of the business and what you've seen, and how you might be prepping clients or prepping yourself for that?
I would just echo what Dave says. We're keenly aware of the changing demands of our clients and prospects, and our commitment is to stay ahead of that. And clients are just not looking for kind of an annual meeting and the annual renewal. They're looking for value, and the value takes many forms, including what we're talking about today, risk mitigation. So I think we're very tuned in, and our sales professionals are very aware of that, and many of them for their entire career have followed this approach. And as you said, as people get more senior, mentoring the next generation.
And I mean, I think it's a very interesting time in insurance. I mean, I know none of us are with carriers, but working with carriers, all the carrier models have been built on actuary historical things, and now we're getting access to more real-time information or close to real-time first-party information even from particular businesses, and that means the the way that policies get written, the pricing on those things. It's a huge opportunity, but also, let's say the ground is sort of moving underneath us about how this is all going to shake out. One of the things that I really like is the idea of value being the primary driver at a brokerage. It used to be that we were told that brokerages and these things were all relationship based, and now to hear, the most cutting edge ones talking about, no, it's about the value we provide to our customer, not just the relationship, because you can have a great relationship, but if you're not providing value, there's not really room for people to hide anymore. It is a kind of all hands on deck thing that I found really separates the growing organizations from those that are not growing the way that they want to be.
Jason, you were just talking about all the things that are changing, and let's throw into that equation. Inflation, settlement inflation, the cost of claims, litigation-driven inflation. I mean, things have changed so much to some extent out of the control of any one industry or any one group that you've got to keep up with it. I mean, what might have been, a $10,000 injury 10 years ago might be 50, might be 100 today. I mean, between the litigation threats out there and just overall, just the cost of claims, the cost of healthcare, the wages, you've got to be on top of it, because you can't necessarily absorb those one or two claims anymore in a way that maybe was taken for granted, 10, 20 years ago.
Right. Or maybe the last time you're like, oh, that's okay, but the last time you did it, the price tag on that was 10K, now it's 100K, and you haven't had that claim in that much time, and you have no idea, right? I see that all the time. People being like, well, it used to not be like this, and you're like, it is now. It is kind of, again, because it's changing, it's just how things get paid out. All of these things it's best to build the culture, like you guys have said from the beginning of this interview, to build the culture around, I wrote the term down and I liked it a lot, but around the idea of risk being a value, not a priority. Like it's core to the value of the organization. And I'm seeing, I work with a lot of construction companies, I work with a lot of property management companies. I do see that builders are now, the people who are actually building projects, as an example, they are looking at people's safety records. They are looking at the risk that it would be for their brand if something happened on a job site. So I'm seeing that all these factors are sort of coming together as this area really becomes mature. I think that National College of Risk and people getting degrees in risk, I'm still talking to people who have been in a career for 30 years who don't have no formal education in risk, right, principles. And that's okay, because that's where we were, but we're just in a very different time with a very different scope of work ahead of us for businesses. And I, for one, think it's a really interesting time, because I think risk is taking its place in the boardroom. Good risk managers are now part of the executive steering team for their company, right? And I think there's never been a better time to get involved in it, but it's such a diverse and interesting topic. I could talk to you guys all day about your experience and what you guys do for your clients, because I just find it fascinating. If it's okay with you guys, any closing words on anything that we kind of just discussed before we move into risky or too risky?
I just wanted to follow up on what you said to come full circle, okay? Because you talked about how we can't put risk over here and growth over there. And a great example is you just talking about the construction industry, right? In other words, if your safety scores, if your workers' compensation experience modifier is above a certain level, for example, you're not going to get on bid lists. I mean, your customers, whatever industry you're in, are performing due diligence on their vendors in a way with rigor that was unheard of 20, 30 years ago. So it's where a well-defined risk management program fuels competitive growth. And I think construction is a great example of an industry where that's so obvious.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing really interesting practices like GCs buying software like TrustLayer for their subcontractors so they get visibility into how their subcontractors manage risk, which is something in the past you would just say, it doesn't matter. I've transferred all the risk down to them. They have their contractors, let them do what they want. But ultimately that isn't good enough. And too many companies have gotten burned on that from all variety of reasons, not just, let's say, paying out claims, but for all the other things that happen, job delays to your reputation to, people not being the trade craftsmen that they need them to be, right? So all of these things kind of affect everything downstream, and is really a very intricate, beautiful ecosystem that's really interesting to be part of. And I look at what the work you guys are doing as being very cutting edge around thinking about it as a cultural issue and thinking about it as a way of fundamentally structuring companies to be more risk focused as a core value. Risky, too risky. I'll start with you, David. Adopting a brand new untested technology in your operations on the recommendation of a new hire, is that risky or too risky?
And you're going to limit me to just risky or too risky, aren't you?
I mean, if you have something to add to it.
You're not going to let me do the risk manager. Let me parse it.
Risky or too risky, sir?
I'm going to go with too risky.
Too risky. How do you vet ideas from the outside that you can't wrap your arms around? In case of this example, a new employee brings technology. How do you go about vetting that in part of your process?
So ideally, we do it on multiple levels, quite honestly. We would want to talk to folks that are already using and deploying it, look at data assessments, figure out how effective it's been. And then in terms of deployment, we'd want to put that in like a quarantine chamber. Let's agree to get some people to beta test that. They understand it's new to us. There's a specific box around this. Let's get our own results as well, both in terms of the efficacy of that technology as well as the user side experience, and how practical is the deployment mixed into that as well. That'd be an ideal.
And that moves it from too risky to risky. Listen, look at your risk management background. You're really hitting it. Brian, let's talk about policy change. Are you going to do the same thing? Is it a pilot? Is it how do you meeting them where they're at and then needing to change them? This is a risky or too risky. The question is it risky or too risky? Obviously, to implement policies that you're aren't sure going to work is probably too risky. But how do you go about meeting them where they're at, but then nudging them to the left of where they need to be?
I think the problem with a lot of policy is that it's not written for the intended audience. I mean, if your audience reads a 5th or 6th grade level and your policy is written at a high school or collegiate level, you don't have policy, you have words on paper. So to mitigate the risk and be sure that people understand and therefore are accountable for the policy, the first thing you've got to do is be sure that the policy is reasonably understandable by the intended audience. And so bringing those who are accountable into the policy development process and getting their opinions goes a long way, because then they own it at the outset.
I love that. Yeah, it is. That's an example of meeting them where they're at, really being taken to the finish line. Question: risky or too risky for you? You have a client who wants to skip their regular compliance training this quarter to cut costs amidst budget constraints. Is that too risky or just risky?
Oh, way too risky. I mean,
I think I'm talking to the wrong two guys here.
Well, let's say the client. Let's say that you didn't train, and now there was an incident, and now you're you're being deposed. One of the questions the plaintiff lawyer is going to ask you is, "Show me your training records." Oh, we got too busy to train. Well, then I guess you didn't train. So, we all have to understand these days that training is important, obviously, to build stronger, more resilient organizations, better workforces. But let's not discount the importance of documented training in defending ourselves if we're ever called on to do so.
Jason, if I can just quickly add to that, I might say, look, there's probably another option that we would at least want to discuss with them if it's a budgetary concern. Hey, maybe gathering everyone together, pulling them off the line or out of the field and putting theirs too costly. Could we leverage technology to do this? Can we still at least get to the approximate effectiveness of that other training using this technique, save you a bunch of CapEx, as you don't have to pull these people aside. But as Brian said to you, that's going to look great until you're being deposed. And you sure don't want to be in the chair explaining why you were too busy or it was out of budget. and this event happened, because frankly, you're in a terrible spot, and that money savings you thought you were getting might have just evaporated as well.
Absolutely. You know, one of the reasons I love Risky or Too Risky is because it really allows the audience on the podcast to see how people who look at risk look at the situations, and then how they can make business. So a lot of these have like the business logic built into them, like as a word problem, to see how you might overcome those. And I really appreciate the way you're going. Last one I have, and this is a real technology one, and both of you can answer this, and I'd want to know how you've driven it. Foregoing traditional risk assessment methods in favor of newly developed AI-driven models. How do you balance the two of those things, you know, with this technology managing? Is it too risky to let go of old models that you might have used and adopt these new AI models? Do you need to run both simultaneously? What's realistic for a company to do?
Brian, why don't I address it from like a fintech perspective, and maybe you could address it from the insurer, the client's perspective. So from our perspective, frankly, I think you need to deploy both. You need to have both options. Your clientele may run a really highly successful business, and they may haul logs, for example. And you go to their operation, it's an amazing yard with a huge log deck, and they're in a double wide. But if you think you're going to, run an AI assessment of that only, and not have to deploy boots on the ground in the yard, in the field, in the woods with these guys, that's not realistic. So, and they may not be receptive. They might be a little, if I can use the term, old school. Yeah. So again, in that same vein of meeting them where they're at, we have to identify that some clients are ready for high-level AI or otherwise tech-driven solutions.
The drones flying over, scanning everything and running that through models, right?
Yeah, and some of them do business. They still want to shake your hand, and they want you to come out, and they want to meet their safety professional and their team and have them deployed. So there's a value to them that's even above and beyond the safety side, is the relational side. So we in our roles do have to balance that as well.
Brian, what about from an insured perspective?
Yeah, I think the idea is to do both. Don't let go of what works until you know that something is better. But you've got to always be experimenting. You've always got to be thinking forward. That's why when Dave and I were both answering too risky. Well, we're really not hiding under a rock. You know what I mean? There's no such thing as a high risk business, because risk can be managed, right? Your business is high consequence because the consequences are high if you don't manage risk. So when we say too risky, it's not, oh, run for the hills and everything's too risky. We help clients day in and day out take smart risks and properly manage risk. But you're not going to avoid risk unless you just, stay home and don't operate. So all of this is a matter of balance, and you'll get some right and some won't go right. But the more you can calibrate risk and the more strategic and methodical you can be, the higher chances are of being right. But I refuse to acknowledge that anything is high risk, because you can manage that.
I sort of take the same thing. My general philosophy has become that risk is a rock, and all of these methods just allow you to rotate the rock in space and see all of the elements of it, right? And there's so many people in our industry, and the reason I always hone in on this part of the interview so much is because there's so many who are, well, AI is nothing, it's not going to do anything. I'm like, well, maybe you should look at how does this actually allow you to see more of that, more of that rock than you could before. Or in the case of old methods, well, what part of that is actually useful in allowing you to view the risk, and what part of it isn't, and having a real understanding that your company doesn't have the full picture of the risk that your company is operating in. Nobody does, because the only moment that you have that true aha moment is when something terrible happens and it's brought to the surface. We all are going to die. There's mortality that's going to happen, yet we try not to think about it most of the time, right? And then when it does happen, we kind of restock what that means in our lives and all the things that are associated to it. And I think of risk as the same thing, where it needs people looking at it not just in the worst of times, but in every moment, constantly rotating that rock in order to figure out how big it is, how much of that is under the ground that we can't quite see. And I find it to be a fascinating industry because of that, and that's one of my favorite things about doing this podcast with great guests like you guys, is being able to take time out of our day to actually nerd out and talk about how important this is to the built world around us. So I really appreciate it. Last question is for yourself, for Acrisure, what's sort of something that you are excited about for the future that you're putting time and energy into going into 2025?
For me, it's pretty straightforward. Just one of the greatest things about working at Acrisure is the amount of importance, the resource allocation, the desire by Acrisure on its whole to be known for its safety and compliance services to clients and to the community in general, just makes it an incredible opportunity for Brian and I to execute our roles. Because we had talked earlier about risk managers not always perceiving that they have the backing of the C-suite.
Yeah.
We have the backing of the C-suite. In fact, in our most important meetings, there are high-level C-suite people represented, contributing to, lobbying for us, and it just sets this incredible environment for us to deploy and make tremendous impact to our clients and their employees.
Amazing. Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I would say something very similar. I mean, nothing makes me happier than when that light bulb goes on and, a client's been wrestling with something and it's a problem or a challenge they just can't seem to get fixed, at least get fixed permanently. And all of a sudden you're helping them and you're giving them strategies and you make them realize that the solutions are right there in-house. You're just helping them unlock the solutions. And when that light bulb goes on, you see them make meaningful change. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you guys for joining me on Brick by Brick. It was a wonderful conversation. We have to have you back. We're doing more roundtable things about topics. We'd love to have you as a guest again. I appreciate both of you. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you. Risk Management Brick by Brick is brought to you by TrustLayer. Find out how TrustLayer manages risk so that the people can build the physical world around us. Head over to TrustLayer.io. And then make sure to subscribe to Risk Management Brick by Brick on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of the TrustLayer team, thank you for listening.